and some still face execution. Visiting Australia for the first time on a teaching tour, His Holiness Sakya Trizin visited the new Parliament House to plead for human rights in his homeland. He fled Tibet in 1959 at just 14, but is still the second highest Tibetan religious leader. Performing a centuries-old religious ceremony, the Buddhist leader and his attendants blessed the new Parliament House, then pleaded for the Australian government to put pressure on China to stop the violence in his country.
It is another way to solve the problems through force, because people are quite determined. So if they really care for the Tibetans, then they have to do some other understanding, some other ways of solutions.
The Tibetan leader is in Australia for 10 weeks before touring Southeast Asia. Michael Heath in Canberra for Eyewitness.
Covered in mystery into the most closed of China's then closed territories, shrouded in secrecy. Nearly 4 decades later, Tibetans have begun to agitate against Chinese rule. Last March, 200 of them were arrested after a protest in the capital Lhasa, many later claiming that they'd been beaten and tortured while in custody. This week, the Australian Foreign Minister, Bill Hayden, visited Tibet, the first foreign official allowed in since the latest troubles began. Travelling with the Haydens was the Nine Network's Peter Harvey, who filed this report for Sunday.
It was all something of a puzzle, just why the Chinese decided, literally overnight, to allow the Haydens and their media caravan to break out of the official trot around China's well-worn watering holes and visit an area that's been closed and closely guarded for most of the almost 4 decades it's been under Beijing's control. Concerned at reports of widespread abuses of human rights, Mr. Hayden had repeatedly made plain Australia's worry over events in Tibet.
There's always a trade-off through a range of interests when you deal with human rights. Just put to one side very large commercial interests which we have and which, if we forfeited by clumsiness, no one in Australia would forgive us.
Nonetheless, the Foreign Minister remains convinced he was able to make his own reasonably accurate judgments about this enigmatic land.
My own impression, but it's not as deep as I would wish, is that the situation here has not been as bad in terms of violation of human rights as some sources have suggested.
Fewer than 2 million Tibetans live in an area the size of the Northern Territory. Though since the Chinese takeover of their country in 1951, they've faced increasing competition from tens of thousands of Han Chinese, technicians, army, bureaucrats, shipped in from what the locals call mainland China. That threat to their integrity seems to sharpen the Tibetans' passion for their religion, a Buddhist faith that pervades everything, everywhere. Early morning outside the enormous palace of the Dalai Lamas, the Patala in Lhasa. Every second person carries a prayer wheel. Almost all carry the 90-bead Buddhist rosary. Many break the journey to work to pray for the return of the God King, self-exiled since fleeing Tibet in 1959. In the crowded markets around the Jogang temple, few beg for money, but almost all will ask the stranger if he brings a photo of the Dalai Lama. Inside the temple, monks chant the old mantras, as they've done since the 8th century. A ritual broken only once, during the Cultural Revolution, when Red Guards used tanks to batter their way in, evict the monks, and rename the temple Official Guest House Number 5. During the decade of persecution that followed, more than 1,000 monasteries were destroyed. Perhaps as many as 50,000 monks executed or deported. Today, the Red Guards have gone, and temples like the Jogang are back in business. Young men are once again becoming monks. And the locals will tell you the authorities do not discourage religion, but neither do they encourage it. To the Chinese troops who jog through Lhasa in the early morning, Tibetan Buddhism is just quaint behavior by another of their vast country's ethnic minorities. Though Mr. Hayden did once manage to shoo away his Chinese minders and hear the monk side of the story, he'd be the last to claim that such a short and controlled visit allowed any more than a surface view of Tibetan problems. But he does believe the agitation for independence is unrealistic.
What is taking place is being driven by a small group of people from the monasteries, a small group of militant monks who do not have the support of the hierarchy or generally of the membership of the monastery. Now, that's what's told to me.
Much as they'd like the Dalai Lama back, many Tibetans can still remember the feudal poverty that preceded Beijing's takeover. Before 1951, life expectancy here was 30 years. It's almost 55 now. Along with that improvement, achieved through Beijing's providing 95% of Tibet's budget, Mr. Hayden believes that in spite of the recent riots and arrests, the days of savage repression ended long ago.
The situation in Tibet is far superior to what it was prior to 1980. Under the Cultural Revolution, Tibet was a particularly sad and seriously disadvantaged casualty.
This journey was a test of tact for Bill Hayden, expressing Australia's concern while not offending the Chinese, avoiding being used to whitewash what remains an uncertain and troubling issue. He believes he succeeded. At the very least, he says, the Chinese have acknowledged international interest in an area they once regarded as nobody's business but their own.
Tibet. The report was by Peter Harvey.
Executing 4 Tibetans. The 4 are among thousands arrested following violent riots in Lhasa in March. They've been accused of killing a Chinese policeman.
What is their crime? Their crime is that in their own land, they want to live as decent, free human beings.
Mr. Wangdi says decades of suppression have forced peace-loving people to resort to violence.
Now there is growing frustration, resentment, especially among the younger people.
Arrived in Australia for talks with human rights to around $12 million. Gabby Hills, SBS News. Senior envoys of the exiled Tibetan leader, the Dalai Lama, have arrived in Australia for talks with human rights groups and political leaders. They say the situation in Tibet continues to flare under oppressive Chinese rule. Also in Australia for a religious tour is one of Tibet's most important Buddhist leaders.
That is why I think
His Holiness Sakya Trizin is a high monk in the Tibetan Buddhist order, second in line to the Dalai Lama. In Australia for 2 months of talks and religious retreats, His Holiness says Buddhist beliefs cut across cultural differences.
Actually, I think that everybody wants happiness, and that no one wants suffering. Everybody wishes to be free from suffering, whether it is in the East or in the West. And so Buddha's teaching is actually to all people.
On a political level, Tashi Wangdi, who is personal envoy to the exiled Dalai Lama, says 6 million Tibetans are suffering under Chinese rule. He says uprisings, which have continued since late last year, are a reaction to the human rights violations of the Chinese government.
Thousands of Tibetans are in prison. Many have been tortured. Many have lost their lives fighting for their rights.
His visits to countries around the world are aimed at pressuring the Chinese to withdraw from Tibet, which they've occupied since 1959.
Well, China wants to play an important role in world politics. And certainly I think the Chinese leaders now that they are coming out in the international scene, that they are much more sensitive to international opinion. And I think the international pressure would be a positive contribution in that way.